Thank you very much. So some new insights into sustainable farming and some new opportunities. So the first thing I think is that we need to look through the challenges in the farm sector and think about the new insights that come with that for sustainable management, and then some opportunities in what I call win-win-win outcomes. So I think there's some really important things here to think through what we can do in this space. So we've already heard about the challenges that are here with us now: increased food demand, issues to do with productivity and degradation. Farm profitability is a big issue in many parts of the world. Farmer mental health is an enormous challenge with that at the moment, particularly, but not only in Australia, but elsewhere in the world. Carbon emissions and climate change, massive issues as well, as we'll talk about in a moment. Biodiversity loss, particularly in agricultural parts of the world, is something really quite profound, and again, we'll touch on that just briefly. And rising issues of animal welfare, as well as a change in the demographics of human populations. So there are some serious challenges here that really need some thinking about what's happening. And let's dig through some of those just briefly. So the latest data that we've seen suggests that really quite close to 3 billion hectares of the planet's arable land is degraded. So this is an area larger than the size of Russia. And approximately half the world's population has to deal with the implications directly of land degradation. So current estimates are that this is going to cost about 2/3 of the US's GDP to tackle this problem. And in 2019, the United Nations has declared the decade of land restoration. So they're aware of the extent of the problem. And the Australian region, Oceania, is not immune from this issue. An estimated 360 million hectares of degraded land exists in this space. And if we look at an even smaller scale, the Murray-Darling Basin has had an estimated 6 billion trees removed from that landscape over the last 150 years. And people have mapped this information at quite a fine scale to give us a sense of where it is and how much is taking place and how quickly that's occurring. So if we move to biodiversity loss, we see some really quite profound figures. So the extinction rates somewhere between 1,000 to 10,000 times background rate of what you would normally see in an evolutionary context. And the estimates are that agriculture is the biggest driver of the loss of biodiversity planet-wide. If we look in terms of mammals, for example, we see some really quite extraordinary figures that were published last year, that 60% of the world's mammal biomass is livestock, 36% is us, and 4%, just 4%, is native mammal biota worldwide. And then if we want to boil that down a little bit further and look at what's happening in Australia, Australia has the world's leading mammal extinction rate, and also the world's leading reptile extinction rate, and we are now moving towards the world's leading frog extinction rate, which we'll publish sometime in the next couple of days in the journal Science. We've seen catastrophic declines in invertebrates. Does that matter? Yes, it does, because some of those declines are actually things that do your pollination service, particularly bees. So if we look at Australia, Australia's extinction rate is 30 times higher than what we see in the USA. So Australia's lost about 10% of its mammal fauna, and it's still occurring. We lose about 3 native species every decade, including this decade that we're in now. So the biodiversity component of this story is quite problematic. The other side of this, another big challenge, is that the climate is changing and changing incredibly quickly. The background rate for CO2 in the atmosphere should be around 280 parts per million. Over the last 800,000 years, that's been the rate up until what we call the start of the Anthropocene. As of January the 22nd, we were on 414.9 parts per million. Now, there's a direct link between the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature forcing, and 2018, as we heard in the first speech, was the hottest year on record, and that was data published by the Bureau of Meteorology in February this year. The IPCC suggests we'll be at 1.5 degrees warmer by 2030, although other people think that we might hit that faster. So the driver here is CO2 in the atmosphere, and these are real data collected on a daily basis from Hawaii. And then we can see how that's manifesting at a continental level in Australia. And we can also see the relationships between temperature and also depressed rainfall. And we all know about what that means. But I think one of the important things here is that, for example, 600 millimetres of rain in 2018 is not what 600 millimetres of rain was in 1950 in terms of its effective impact on the land. So a massive challenge there to think about what that means. And changes in human populations. So roughly half of the world's population lives in cities at the moment, and that's going to move further to roughly 2/3. And in Australia, we're already way beyond that at close to 90%. And urban people have really quite different concerns often than rural people do, and there are aspects of urban people's concerns that are really somewhat different to the rest of the society. And in an Australian context, roughly 2/3 of the continent is agricultural land or used for agricultural production. And so we have to really think deeply about what the balance is between all these different competing issues, the challenges, productivity, environmental management, biodiversity, production, those kinds of things. So where we've come to in this space is looking at these issues through what we call the Sustainable Farms Project. And this links together the College of Business and Economics from a financial perspective, the National Centre for Mental Health Research, and the Fenner School, which specialises in environmental condition and environmental management. So this is a truly cross-disciplinary study to look at the intersection of mental health with environmental condition, farm productivity and profitability in relation to environmental conditions and its link with both of those. And so what we've badged this study as healthy farmers, healthy farms, healthy profits, because it looks at the critical intersections of all those three things. And so this is based on the last 20 years of long-term monitoring, where we've visited well over 1,000 sites on almost 300 farms on a regular basis for almost 2 decades, collecting detailed environmental condition data, but we also now have data sets on farmer mental health and some data on profitability. And this is based on people that speak paddock speak. So these are people that are on the land, that are living in towns such as Forbes and Cowra and Albury and other parts of rural Australia. And they're working with farmers on a day-to-day basis, collecting data to tell us what's changing. And some of these natural assets, as we call them, are changing on a regular basis, and we need to track those changes. And this is really important. We think of these assets, farm dams, shelter belts, patches of remnant vegetation, creek lines and streamlines. We think of these as natural assets and how we would invest in these natural assets to improve them for multiple benefits. Benefits for carbon, benefits for biodiversity, benefits for farm productivity, but also, as we'll talk about in a moment, benefits for farmer mental health. So, for example, we have seen a very extensive effort to revegetate parts of the wheat sheep belt in southern Australia. What's been the effect of that? Well, nobody really knows unless you actually measure it. And that's exactly what we've been doing for the last 2 decades. And we've seen quite substantial changes in patches of vegetation cover, including shelter belts. And we can map that from the air, from satellites and from aerial photography as well as on the ground. And we actually see that biodiversity, in many cases, is responding very positively. What's actually really hard to get into the media often is that there's a good news story in large parts of rural Australia where we make well-informed interventions on the land. And some of the iconic species. This is an animal called the superb parrot, which is an iconic animal for the area called Burrawa, close to Yass, near Canberra. This is the community's animal, and we have seen substantial increases in populations of this species with the right kinds of interventions. Things do work when you use science to guide how to do well-informed management. Now, we also have a very grumpy Australian animal called the noisy miner. Now, this is a bird that should go to rebirthing classes. It loves to beat up every other species of bird that's smaller than that across farms. And it's been declared a key threatening process because there are literally millions of these birds, and if you do shelter belts in the wrong way, you can actually increase habitat for this animal and cause major declines in other species. But if you do restoration in the right way, you can drive down numbers of these things and you can solve the key threatening process. So one approach to solving this animal is to use what we call lead therapy, where we place a small piece of lead in a long barrel and shoot it down the barrel and into the bird, and it solves the problem. Our estimates are that lead therapy would cost in the range of about $720 million to solve this problem. But we know that when we do informed kind of management and do appropriate kinds of enhancements in shelter belts, we can actually solve this problem. And we can make shelter belts more functionally effective so that you get better lambing success, you get better shade, and you get better production gains in your livestock, especially if you're dealing with black cattle, Angus, that gets very hot in the summer, that actually needs shade. So our approach is very different from the NRA's process. We can solve this problem with trees and not guns. And we can do it very effectively and very cost effectively, particularly when you do the cost-benefit analysis to look at this approach. And we're using science to think about how to make informed decisions in this area. So part of the Sustainable Farms project is to think about valuing these natural assets, be it farm dams or shelter belts and the like, and then understanding the financial benefits of looking at these natural assets on farms, and then beginning to think about quantifying the links between those natural assets, farm productivity, farm profitability, but also farmer mental health. We do have strong anecdotal evidence that farmers that engage in more informed, effective management in this way actually are in a better mental health state, which is really quite a revelation for us. So management of farm dams is a really good example of this. And what we see from our surveys at the moment is that 97% of farm dams in the southern part of Australia that we work in are not functioning appropriately. And the real concern is that when the drought eventually breaks, huge amounts of excrement and other wastes are going to be washed into these dams, and they're basically going to be non-functional. Essentially, animals are going to be drinking their own urine and faeces. So hopefully, in partnership with government, we'll be able to start to rethink how you re-engineer and remodel these kinds of attributes of the natural assets on farms to make them more functional. So this is a farm dam that is working. We get better water quality. We get better livestock production outcomes. There is one study globally that has looked at this. There's a 23% weight gain from work done in Canada when animals drink high quality water. From human population perspectives, we looked at this issue of water quality 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And so we need to invest in the science to start to look at this. But we see that when we revegetate around farm dams, and there are good examples of this, because we're looking at this in a cross-sectional study, we see that well-managed farm dams have lower water temperatures. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because some breeds of livestock can't drink the water once it's beyond about 30 degrees Celsius, and that has enormous impacts on weight gain. We see that there's very good biodiversity benefits in limited small areas. So you get a biodiversity benefit, you actually get a carbon co-benefit. And one of the things that was a revelation to us is that many farmers that had undergone these restoration works around these farm dams had not only got better water quality, but these were the places where they put their picnic tables and sat with their husbands or wives and had a glass of wine or a glass of beer and looked at what they'd done in changing the attributes on their farms. There's a significant positive mental health outcome from undertaking these kinds of changes. It might sound a bit trivial, but in fact, when you start to do the interviews with people, it's actually really important in terms of being able to look out at what you've done on a farm and how things have improved and the benefits for that. And so we've now started to think about, how do you do this? How do you fence areas? How do you create a hardened access point so that livestock actually walk down into the water, drink the water, and then walk out of the dam, and they pee and poo elsewhere, not in the water that they're going to drink? It's really interesting behavioural aspects to this. It means also that there's less sediment flow into the dam, which means that you have to dig out the dam less frequently. And when we do the cost-benefit analysis, it's really quite extraordinary. We see that for roughly $274,000 investment in re-engineering these farm dams, within 3 to 4 years of normal conditions, we see a return of about $990,000. So it's about a 30 times return on investment with that initial and preliminary cost-benefit analysis. So that's pretty exciting. So where we're at is to collect the kinds of evidence to start to rethink how some of these natural assets work on farms, how we might re-engineer those assets so that they deliver more in terms of productivity, profitability, but other co-benefits around carbon and biodiversity, and then start to think about innovative new ways of farm loans and finance to tackle some of these land degradation issues. And then think about that in a more holistic sense about how you re-engineer farm planning, new generations of farm planning in this space. And then we've thought about, well, we need to actually start to publish some of this information so that people have access to it. We publish books and then we give them to people that we work with. We don't collect the royalties. Scientists never make money out of publishing books, and we're not alone in that space. And that sort of brings us to the last part of this discussion, and that is that there really are huge challenges, but there are also huge opportunities. And there's a growing body of evidence to help make well-informed decisions about the kinds of management interventions that we can do to promote not only better profits, better productivity, but co-benefits that all people are looking for, as we heard in the first talk, around biodiversity outcomes, around productivity outcomes, and true sustainability outcomes. Thanks very much.